Hello, everybody, and you're very welcome to this webinar, COP26, What Can We Expect? Thank you for joining us. I'm thrilled to be talking to you this lunchtime. My name is Tara Shine. I am Director of Change by Degrees. We're a company based in Kinsale here in Ireland. We work on sustainability, and I am delighted to be part of this event this afternoon. Today's webinar is one of over 70 online and in-person events that are taking place as part of the inaugural Dublin Climate Action Week 2021. And you can find out more about the other events that are on this week at www.dublinclimateactionweek.ie. So lots and lots and lots for you to take part in. Dublin Climate Action Week has been organised and delivered by the partnership of Dún Laoghaire-Rathdown County Council, South Dublin County Council, Dublin City Council, Fingal County Council, Codema, which is Dublin's energy agency, and the Dublin Climate Action Regional Office, also called a CARA. The overall vision of Dublin Climate Action Week 2021 is to highlight Dublin's climate action progress to its citizens and to demonstrate the leadership role that the 4 local authorities are playing in conjunction with their partners. For those of you that don't already know, each local authority has a climate change action plan, and you can see them online at www.dublinclimateactionweek.ie. Now, for those of you that are active on social media, you might want to help spread the word as well about this event and other events that you might be taking part on during Dublin Climate Action Week. We have 2 hashtags. The first is hashtag DCAW21, DCAW21, and the other is hashtag Taking Action Together. So please do spread the word on social media and let more people know about the week and the events and how they can take part. So this session on COP26 and what we can expect is a panel discussion. So I am delighted to be joined by 3 great panelists, and I'm going to introduce each of them to you now before we start our discussion. So first up is someone that I think many of you that follow climate issues in Ireland will know. It's Emeritus Professor John Sweeney. John has been at the University of Maynooth since 1978, so in fact since before some of us were born, but we'll not dwell on that. Hey John, and I was born by then, so I can't even claim that. He has served as president of the Irish Meteorological Society, the Geographical Society of Ireland, and on Taisce. John has also contributed to reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. He is a regular contributor to print and broadcast media on everything to do with climate change science and policy. And he has attended several COPs, in fact, many COPs in the past. So we'll be asking John all about his experience there. So John, you're very welcome.
Thanks.
Next up is Dr. Frank McGovern. Frank is Chief Climate Scientist with the Environmental Protection Agency here in Ireland. He is also chair of the Joint Programming Initiative on Climate. So this is an initiative at the level of the European Union, which aligns the development of climate research in the European research area. He is also a very regular delegate to meetings of the UNFCCC, that's the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he leads for Ireland at meetings of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Frank is an atmospheric physicist by profession and serves as a member of a number of European expert bodies. So Frank, you're also very welcome.
Thank you, Tara.
And our third panelist today is John Finnegan. John is Principal Officer in the Department of Environment, Climate and Communications. His team are responsible for Ireland's engagement at the international level in relation to climate policy. So his team represents Ireland as part of the European 27 in inputting into our positions and our negotiations within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. John's unit are also responsible for climate legislation here in Ireland, including this year's Climate Action Act, and they're also responsible for ongoing work, I'm sure, which is very busy around our national climate action plans. And before joining the department, John worked as a consultant economist in these same areas of climate, environment and transport. So John, you're also very welcome.
Thank you very much.
So We're going to hear from the panel shortly, but just before we get started, I want to remind you that in the audience that you can also get involved by using the Q&A tab in the webinar. So if you've got a question as we go, please feel free to add your question there, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can as we go. So COP26, this is what we're here to talk about today. Do you have any clue what it is? Well, first of all, it's on this November. 2021. It has been postponed from last year, 2020, due to COVID. It's on in Glasgow, so it's being hosted by the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom have the presidency of the COP, and it will be hosted in the city of Glasgow. A COP is the annual summit, the annual meeting of all of the countries that have signed up to be parties to the convention. And so traditionally, it meets every single year to progress the agreements between all 197 countries around what more they will do together in a collaborative way to take action to reduce the causes of climate change and to adapt to the impacts that we're already experiencing. And as I say, to work in solidarity between the countries that are causing most of the problem and those countries that are experiencing the worst of the problem to find common solutions. And COP26 is very important because it is an important milestone post the Paris Agreement, which was agreed in 2015, for countries to come back to the table and say what more they will do to get us closer to the temperature goals set in Paris, to hold warming to well below 2 degrees and to pursue 1.5 degrees of warming. Frank can talk to us a little about how much more we now understand around the significance of those temperature targets and how they inform what more ambition every country needs to bring to the table in Glasgow. So we'll get more insights into what a COP is as we talk to our panelists. I've been to a good few of them myself, as has Frank and John. John Sweeney, that is. John Finnegan will be having a baptism of fire at COP26. So we have lots of experience to call on. I'm lucky enough to have attended as a negotiator, as Frank does currently, as an influencer, which is how John Sweeney now also attends COPs, where we go and we advocate for a particular issue. So I was there as an advocate for climate justice alongside Mary Robinson, and now I attend COP with a role serving the United Nations Convention as co-facilitator of a structured expert dialogue between scientists and policymakers. So that will come up in the conversations we might have with Frank around the role of science in informing climate policy. But let's get started and let's understand a little bit more about what these COPs are. So Professor John Sweeney, I would like to start with you because you've been to many, many COPs over the years, and I'd love to know what has been your experience of a COP and how will you be involved in this year's COP? Over to you.
Okay, so thanks very much, Tara. I'm just going to try and share my screen very quickly here. Yes, I mean, as Tara said, I'm going to my 10th COP, and it's particularly special for myself because I was born and brought up in Glasgow, so I know my way around the city fairly well. So I'm looking forward to it immensely, but there will be 20,000 people there plus. So it's going to be quite an event, and I'm delighted to be able to share some of my experience and some of my sort of, I suppose, personal experience of how COPs have gone over the past few years. I think, you know, to go back to the very beginning, of course, the COPs started in 1995, and your viewers are probably wondering, how have we spent 26 attempts to fix climate and still not managed to do it? And there are a lot of reasons for that, of course. The 1995 first COP was chaired by a very young Minister for the Environment in Germany called Angela Merkel. And they had a policy then of a top-down approach, which was to issue for the developed countries binding commitments for emissions reductions. And they were to be formalized, as we know, in COP3, which was to be held in Kyoto. And that was part of the initial problems of the COPs, in that we saw in Kyoto that the US, for example, wouldn't play ball. And there has been a whole series of, if you like, snakes and ladders in policy that have happened since. Some years with good progress being made, other years with kind of cajoling of countries to try and join, other years whereby progress in the protocol was made and informed judgments were made based on the IPC assessments occurring at the time. But it takes us forward to perhaps the first milestone in COP, which was the Copenhagen meeting, COP15, which came at the end, if you like, of the Kyoto period, when compliance with Kyoto was going to give way to a new arrangement, hopefully to encompass all of the nations of the world, including the developing countries. And in many ways, my experience in Copenhagen kind of mirrors the kind of hype we're seeing now about COP26 in Glasgow. There was at the time, and there is now, great optimism, a great surge, if you like, of enthusiasm that finally we'll come to grips with this problem, that finally we will take, if you like, climate out of the political realm and recognize, if you like, the importance of tackling this from the point of view of global solidarity and from the point of view of everybody in the world, both developed and undeveloped countries getting involved. And that was something, unfortunately, which wasn't realized at Copenhagen. And there was a hiatus for a few years afterwards until the Paris Agreement or the Paris COP came along. I mean, there was problems, as we know, even after that from the administrations in the United States. But when we got to Paris, and you know, this is the other thing that one notices in COP, the sort of, if you like, the way in which people mingle and people that you wouldn't expect to see flurrying by you with their negotiating team, and you know, people that you think of as household names. It's one of the things which, if you like, brings the politicians and civil society together, because there is a tendency at COP to separate too. And there is a separation between, for example, the NGOs and civil society and the, if you like, the negotiators in their suits, who kind of move in a separate channel at times from that. And outside, of course, there may well be a great groundswell of other things happening. But inside, in these great barns of negotiating rooms, 195 countries, and I think this year 200 negotiating bodies actually try to get to grips with the issues of the day. And one of the most overwhelming experiences for me is to see the rest of the world. You may be walking side by side with somebody from the Arctic or an Amazonian Indian, or even you may be listening to, as in this case, the president of Tuvalu, coming on to the global audience and crying that, you know, he's being, his civilization, his home is being threatened by actions which have not really the responsibility of his own people. And this brings home, I think, to everybody, first of all, our Eurocentric view and the importance of climate change to other parts of the world, which sometimes I don't think we fully appreciate. But because there are so many people involved, you obviously can't have everybody talking at once. So there are negotiating blocks who represent, if you like, many interests, such as the developing countries or such as the EU. And people speak on behalf of those rather than individual countries always having their say at each of those negotiating. Some of them move around. For example, the group of 77 in China, mainly the developing countries. China now a bit of a square peg in a round hole in that group in many respects because of its rapid development since. But this is part of the problem of getting agreement. And of course, the big problem in the United Nations is that you need unanimity. You need everybody to agree before anything is agreed. And that can be very difficult to achieve, both within those blocks. For example, even within the EU, very contrasting viewpoints come out. But between those blocks, there are obviously fundamental differences between the small island developing states, for example, and some of the more oil-producing states, for example, which may well emerge as well. So there's a lot of issues that come out. And of course, the big thing is, can we get some kind of choreography in advance? And this was achieved for Paris, especially between President Obama and President Xi here, helped by Ban Ki-moon, who was tireless, helped by Pope Francis's Laudato Si, and helped by the French diplomatic system under Francois Hollande. So a change in approach here developed, not a top-down emission reduction approach, but rather saying to countries, well, what can you do? And that brings the civil society people much more closer into contact with decision makers, and it proved successful in Paris. There's always a small group of people go from Ireland. I think there will be many more this year. And as somebody who goes as an independent scientist and who liaises with civil society a lot there, I know that their main preoccupation is getting information, finding out what's happening, what position is Ireland taking on issues, is progress being made or not. And to help that, that's always the big problem. Usually the Minister for the Environment will meet shortly with the delegation from Ireland, the civil society delegation. And apart from that, the rest rely on, I suppose, press briefings, press conferences, daily printed sheets, and some other large NGOs like Climate Action Network, who do also provide details as well. So information is always the difficulty at such a large meeting. And of course, the people to watch out for this year are the key negotiators. Frank may well say something more about that, but watch out for what John Kerry does, and the relationship with Xi Jinping, a key relationship. The two of those have been in close contact for a decade or more now, and that's going to be the thing to watch this year. Frans Timmermans from the EU, as I say already, the EU is not as relevant in terms of global emissions as we sometimes think. It's probably around 11%. But nevertheless, they have a lot of clout in terms of moral authority. And the other two to watch for, Prakash Javadekar, the Indian negotiator, again, that will be a key situation, a key position to be watching for, and Alok Sharma, of course, from the UK, who will chair the meetings. And watching all of that will be the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, and of course, watching it as well will be other bystanders like, of course, Greta Thunberg, Pope Francis, Joe Biden, Attenborough, and Nicola Sturgeon. So a lot of these personalities will be worth watching over the course of the COP. And finally then, the big questions. Well, what kind of big issues remain? And they are really, can we get those NDCs agreed between China and the US, which will give hope that we can tackle this problem? Because those are the two that really have to come to some kind of radical agreement. Yeah, just finishing.
No, I'm just going to challenge you. NDC, it's the first mention of it.
Okay, yes.
Webinar. So will you just explain to people
nationally determined? Let's call them pledges. That's the easiest thing to do. And they are going to be renewed, those pledges, as we said, at this meeting. The other issues then is how we handle sequestration or collecting of carbon and trading of carbon. And will we get the agreement that the developing countries need to finance their transition in a sustainable way? I think we will actually this year get that agreement in 100 billion per year. And then the last 3 points quickly, well, will we get some debt remission for those countries trying to tackle the extremes of climate, which are now becoming more common? Will we get, especially China, to be more flexible in terms of debt remission? And can we use the climate and biodiversity emergency to, if you like, change course? And lastly then, of course, we've talked about science informing policy. Sadly, it doesn't inform policy as much as it should. And with the recent assessment report of the IPCC, it is, as we know, a red letter warning for us all. But the IPCC reports have not been historically welcomed by all of the countries at the COPs meetings, and that tells us a little about national self-interest coming to the fore in many ways. So those are the big things I think that we should be watching out for in November, and let's hope that those big questions will be positively resolved in terms of global sustainability for the future. Thanks.
Thank you, John. It's an excellent introduction, and we'll of course be back to you as our conversation goes on. You highlight there the key political questions, which are: can countries come to a COP, a global meeting, and act in the interest of global solidarity rather than in the self-interest of their countries? And that's really what it boils down to, these arguments, if you like, these negotiating positions that countries go to a COP with. And then, as John explained, people come with these differing views on what they would like out of a COP, but we have to agree by consensus as to what the next step is that we will collectively take as a global community. And that's where all the toing and froing and the conversations by the people in suits in those small rooms take place. I've been unlucky enough to be locked into those small rooms for very many hours of my life, as has Frank McGovern. But Frank is not a politician, he is a scientist. And Frank, as I understand, your job is to bring science into the COP to make sure that the conversations that you have and that your peers and other negotiators have are informed by science. So my first question to you is, how will science, especially we've just heard of the latest IPCC report, John was alluding to it there, how does it feed in and inform this political process that John was describing?
Thank you very much, Tara. And first, I want to congratulate all of those who are involved in Climate Action Week. Really, it's an excellent initiative. So very well done. Just going back to your question, and I think John has alluded to a lot of what I was going to say. Science is fundamental to our understanding of climate change and its causes, its consequences, and also it's fundamental to solving this problem. There's quite a mixed history, I suppose, in bringing science into the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The IPCC, as John has mentioned, is the key body for providing that scientific understanding. It was established back in 1988. Ahead of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and its first report was really fundamental to establishment of the convention in 1992. The second report was instrumental in getting the Kyoto Protocol over the line. The third and fourth reports were really very important, but for various reasons, their impacts were quite limited. And we had the fifth assessment report, which was published back in 2013 and 2014. And that really had a major impact. It really informed the goals that were adopted in the Paris Agreement. The reason for that is that governments had time to consider its findings in some detail. And obviously the EU and I suppose Ireland as part of the EU team were key to that process in establishing the structured expert dialogue, which you mentioned at the outset, and that structured expert dialogue is where the scientists sit down with the governments and talk in detail about what the science says and how it's best to respond to it. And that review, John mentioned Copenhagen, that review was actually initiated from the COP in Copenhagen back in 2009. As John says, it was famous for not delivering on expectation. I'm not sure we're in the same place in Glasgow. I think we're in a different world. So I think there's a different level of expectation. But we still see that dealing with the IPCC under the convention is quite difficult, and how the special report on warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius, which was requested in Paris, it was not well received within the UNFCCC, I would have said, and some may remember the headlines around that. But that report is a really valuable and focused report. Many governments and others, businesses included, have taken its messages on board, and they've used them in their long-term low emission strategies, which is the other element of Paris that goes along with the NDCs, the pledges, as John called them. The pledges are the shorter term, they should fit into the long-term low emissions strategies that all governments have agreed to provide. Obviously, we now have the 6th assessment report. It's, it really confirms the finding of other reports. What is new is the clarity. It's really explicit on what we need to do, and the key message is net zero carbon dioxide emissions is an essential precondition for stabilizing the global temperature. So, Glasgow, it's great that John will be there to show us around and bring us around all of the various night spots in Glasgow. But there's two real aspects to the COPs. There's the official side, and the official side is really quite boring. I know people are interested in it, but it's really a lot of work that is needed to keep the process going. And the fact that we haven't had a COP, and this is the first COP since the Paris Agreement, means there's an awful lot of stuff, official sort of stuff, that has to be progressed. And those, Tara, you're aware of that, and John Finnegan will certainly be aware of that. And that work needs to be done, and it's tedious and boring, but it's really important. The bigger picture, probably stuff in terms of, as John said, the rules and the architecture of these, the markets. How do we work the markets in? How do we ensure transparency? And how do we enable this to happen? The means of implementation, the capacity building, the finance, all of those will be part of the discussions. As you've said, the 6th assessment report, we have the 2nd review process, so that will be an avenue for it. I'm sure it will be welcomed. We will see the process that comes out of that, but we certainly have now that review process, the structured expert dialogue, and in 2023, the really key one, the global stock take, when we take stock of all of those NDCs and long-term strategies and see is it sufficient. And at that point, we will have not just the Working Group 1 report from the IPCC, we'll have the Working Group 2 report, which addresses the impacts on the adaptation side, and the Working Group 3 report, which tells us how to achieve the climate goals in terms of mitigation. So what would I expect? I would expect to hear a lot about ambition, perhaps at the high level section, perhaps at side events rather than within the process itself. So statements about net zero carbon dioxide, climate neutrality, specific actions on key gases such as methane and other climate forces, perhaps initiatives on difficult areas such as transport, such as heating and cooling, how to address the large-scale deforestation to protect the sinks. Obviously, agriculture and food security are key issues, and statements on climate finance for adaptation, protecting the most vulnerable countries from the extremes of climate change, as John has mentioned. So I think I'll close there for now. I say we've got a really robust report from the IPCC. The messages are clear, and hopefully we will take them on board firmly at COP26. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, lots of information there. So basically, a lot of science. A lot of that science is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is intergovernmental, so it is negotiated. And that process is, if you like, the science machine that informs the political process that is the UNFCCC. And so when Frank says something like, will it be welcomed? That sounds strange, doesn't it? Of course, the policymakers would welcome the science, but they do have to do that. They have to actually welcome and acknowledge the scientific reports, but then they have to take the time to understand what that science means in terms of the level of ambition that they need to put into their commitments. And ambition is a big word that gets bandied around, but it basically says, what more are you going to do to A, reduce the pollution that you put in the atmosphere, B, prepare for the impacts of climate change that are now inevitable, those forest fires, those heat waves, those droughts, and C, what are you going to do to cooperate in terms of finance, technology, and building skills amongst everybody in the world so that all countries can take action on climate at the same time. And that is quite the process. And that's where Frank is describing the parts that maybe he and I sat in. We sat firmly in places with the people in the suits for many, many years. Terribly boring. We fight over commas and full stops, and it's very hard to communicate to anybody else. But around that is a much more vibrant space where business and NGOs and creators and innovators and influencers and actors, and everybody comes to kind of show that they support this process and that they want those sitting in the small rooms to do more, to be as brave and courageous and ambitious as they can be. And so in that way, a COP is a total mixture of long hours in boring rooms right at the heart of it, and almost like an expo atmosphere going on right around it. So you can have very, very different experiences according to where you land. Now, John Finnegan, I'm sure would love to be going over to the expo side of things, but instead you will be leading Ireland's team right into the very heart of the boring bit, right into the official negotiations.
Yeah, I have been specially selected to lead the boring part of the delegation.
But as Frank said, it is very, very significant and very important work.
No, and it's hugely influential, and it can, when it works, it can achieve a huge amount. I mean, John's presentation in particular really gave a picture of how hard it is. You're trying to get consensus between hundreds of independent states, but where it works, it's very powerful. And I think the Paris Accord is a great example of that, that you've got 195, 196 states actually all agreed on the 1.5 degree target, more importantly agreed what we all needed to do to achieve that, to reach a global peak in greenhouse gases as soon as possible, and to go climate neutral by 2050. And that's actually turned into action. The EU as a whole just adopted its climate law this year, and that's put climate neutrality by 2050, carbon neutrality by 2050 is now a legally binding obligation on the EU. And there's a whole suite of laws about emissions trading and burden sharing about how we're going to get from here to there. And in the same way, that zero by 2050 goal is now in law in Ireland now with the Climate Act. And as you said, that was adopted just before the summer break for the Dáil, and we're now working as fast as we can to work with the Climate Advisory Council to get the budgets and the sectoral ceilings and the action plan as to how we're going to do that. So it's a very big, complicated process. I think I'm still looking forward to it after all of this, learning all of this, but when it works, it's amazingly powerful. And there's a huge amount of stuff, I think Ireland, and that's officials, politicians, NGOs, I think we all are hoping to achieve, and I think we can achieve. I mean, it's an opportunity for us to show leadership. We've a great leadership role to show because we're part of the EU, which is a leader in these things. We've adopted our own climate act, and we'll have our action plan, so we can have a certain authority to drive people on to make the pledges that are needed. I mean, another thing that we're very involved in, and we were talking to the NGOs about this last week, and we'll be accrediting people to come out, is solidarity. One of the most important things about climate change is the people who did the least to emit carbon in the past are the people who are going to suffer the worst from the effects of it, and who are worst placed to reduce their emissions and are worst placed to adapt for these changes. So, this is finance, as we call it, development. It has to be part of this, and it's an area where we're small. We give, we cooperate. We're very much involved with the less developed countries. We've close relationships with the small island states. So it's an area where we'd like to continue to show leadership as well, and sort of champion the needs of these places. As if that wasn't enough, there's Article 6. Is another thing we're hoping to move on. I mean,
so explain again, John touched on it, but let's make sure we don't fall into lingo here. What's Article?
I suppose the simplest way to put it is, it doesn't matter where carbon comes from. When it's emitted, it hurts us all. So if there are places where there are opportunities to reduce emissions, the people who are best able to pay for that should have an incentive to do it. If there are places where it's easy to sequester or to gather carbon in and store it out of harm's way, we should do that. So there should be a market or flows or aid or some mechanism to get the resources to where they can most effectively reduce or sequester, as we say carbon. And that's the principle. It's very simple. Obviously, the details of how you do that are complicated, but this is our big chance to do that. Welcoming the science is very important. I mean, domestically, the IPCC recent report, I don't think anybody on this call was surprised by anything in it. But what's new about it is it was so unequivocal, it was so clear, and it would be a huge step forward if the COP welcomed it and accepted it, and if you like, just moved on and accepted the facts and the science as we understand them now. So there's plenty of opportunities, as I think. There's lots of very important things on the agenda, and there's a lot to play for at it. Okay, so Tara?
Oh, sorry, someone muted me back then. You'd think that 2 years in we'd all be experts at this mute unmute. No, I was going to say thank you, John. I think we're all really excited to hear that Ireland will be going in a leadership role to Glasgow. I think that's really welcome. We see how that international level of policy making has filtered down to us now with our with the 2021 Climate Action Act, with our commitments to net zero emissions by 2050, with our 2030 target. All of this is informed both by the science that comes from the IPCC, but also this international and European level decision making. I want to come back to you for one more thing in one moment, John. I just wanted to remind the audience, please, to send in your questions via the Q&A. There's some excellent questions coming in already. You can also upvote questions that you think are particularly worthy to make sure that they come to the top of our list in terms of getting answers to them. John Finnegan, what I wanted to ask you as well is, you're working really hard in preparation for this COP now. You're then going to go, sorry to break this to you, for about 2 weeks away off to Glasgow and get very little sleep and possibly not eat very well and come back a shell of yourself. So what will success look like for you, for Ireland? Actually, not for you, but for Ireland. What will the successful COP look like?
I think no backsliding. And
what does that mean? That's the thing we say. We don't.
Yeah, because we have. I suppose it's the pledges. I think it's a good word for them, as John said. I mean, it's a bottom-up approach that seems to be working well. The test of it now is if we speaking of the 200 parties, get the pledges that realistically build towards the goal we've all set ourselves. It's a very simple goal. But
I think that's really important for people to know. So we said in Paris that we wanted to keep warming well below 2 degrees and pursue 1.5. The commitments, the pledges that are on the table right now have us closer to 3 degrees of warming, which would be catastrophic for humanity. So Glasgow is this really important moment in time where all the countries come back to the table and say what more they will do, what more action they will take to get us closer to those goals that we've set for ourselves. Yeah. And so what will Ireland be bringing? What will we be bringing in our suitcase to say this is what we will do?
I think we're bringing a very realistic, we've made it legal. We've actually created a permanent legal obligation on all governments. We've taken it out of politics in a way. Commitment to net zero by 2050 and to a 51% reduction in emissions by 2030. That's a legal obligation on the government now. That's a commitment. So we can say, and we will have the action plans. We'll be able to actually point at the concrete actions we're taking. So we can say, look, this is our pledge. This is what we're going to do for our emissions. And it's realistic and it's planned and it will get us there. And that's what we think everybody else should be doing. Also in parallel, we have the development and the finance end of things where we can say that, look, this is what we think ourselves, we and the rest of the developed world should be doing to aid those other regions which have done less to cause this problem and are suffering more from it. So I suppose, we are realistically small, but it's leading by example. It's being able to say, look, we're doing what we think is the right thing. It's possible. There are choices to be made. There are prices to be paid, but we're showing that it can be done.
Okay, so John, I'm going to throw the first question from the audience to you because it's specifically on this point of the finance. It comes from Ed, and several people have upvoted it. And it's at the crux of this injustice that you explain around climate change, where that those experience the worst impacts are not those that have caused the problem, hence a commitment to this solidarity in the form of finance. So how big an issue will the missing annual $100 billion a year commitment to developing countries be at the Glasgow COP? So how much is it going to influence this conversation on finance? How much is that going to influence the discussions? Sorry, halfway through reading it, the question disappeared. But
okay. Look, it can only be a huge influence. It's already the UK presidency have obviously been working all year to prepare for this, and publicly and in political context, they're signalling that this is a huge priority for them to sort of credibly show the real action by the developed world on this. So it's definitely on the agenda. There's definitely pressure from the chair, from the presidency, from the EU, from the OECD to produce something realistic and that does the job on finance. Inevitably, that's I suppose what everybody on this call would like, but all the signals are there, that it's going to be on the agenda, and that the pressure is coming from all quarters to do the right thing on this.
I think it's an important thing for the audience to realise is that this sum of money is not just a sum of money, it's actually the glue, it's the trust that hangs the international process together. And so developing countries really do look to the developed countries to deliver on the promises that they make, not just in terms of emissions reductions, but also in terms of finance. Another great question here, John, that I'll pass to you, John Sweeney, from Darren Clark. He's interested in the panel's view on how we can achieve Ireland's 2030 targets and our 2050 climate neutrality commitment when in the past we haven't met our 7%, when we didn't meet the 7% annual reduction in 2020, even in the midst of COVID. John, step in.
Well, that's a challenging question, and undoubtedly it represents a very difficult national challenge for Ireland, given that we hadn't managed to deliver the goods, not just during the pandemic, but really during the past 20 years when we failed miserably to meet our commitments. I think, as John was saying, the fact that legally those targets are now enshrined in the legislative process will help considerably in focusing minds on actually doing and delivering the goods. But it's certainly true to say that it will require a radical change in Irish society. Yeah. It will require a radical change in how we transport people, in how we grow food, and in how we heat our houses. And I think there's no point in underestimating the way in which that will be opposed by vested interest groups in the next few years. But equally so, this is a decision that has been made by the legislature, by the electorate, and therefore we have no choice but to actually take those radical decisions down the road. It's rather like the pledges that are being made in COP26 by countries as well. I mean, you talked a little about fighting over commas and full stops. And that's because, people do try to wriggle out of their commitments. And we've seen in the pledges, for example, countries are very skilled at maybe changing the starting date or changing the conditionality with which they will meet the pledge according to how much money they get or what their political circumstances are. Those are the things that we have to sort out in Paris, but those are the things which will arise also in some shape or form in Ireland as well. And what we need is resolute leadership to stand up to those interests, because here we're talking about such a serious matter that we mustn't let short-term vested interests get in the way, not just of national solidarity in an Ireland context, but of global solidarity as well in the context of the UNFCCC.
Thank you, John. Yeah, that point is so well made that the legal commitment that we have now in the Act should be a greater lever for us making decisions as a nation that have a longer term focus than just a short term one that's tied up in electoral cycles. And that is a very hopeful, very hopeful point. Frank McGarvin, I wanted to put one of these questions to you. This comes up all the time. So it's about compliance. What happens if countries don't do what they say? So this question is from Michelle O'Sullivan. Will the COP lay out sanctions for countries that make pledges? So they say they will do something in their nationally determined contribution, but then they don't achieve that goal. How are they held accountable?
Yeah, just on the previous question, I just want to say, Ireland did actually meet its commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. It didn't meet them in the most elegant manner, I must say, in the first commitment period, and under the last commitment period, we didn't meet our targets through domestic actions, but we will be able to meet our targets through the EU sharing scheme. So Ireland actually has met its targets. I'd like to just put that on the record. And I would hope that it will continue to do so, and particularly since it has embraced some very ambitious targets now. And John is absolutely right. To achieve that sort of systemic, that type of target, you need systemic changes. And those systemic changes take time. And I think that's the problem, that we have this urgency and everybody wants to achieve things, but we do need to make those investments. And Ireland is still 90% dependent on fossil fuels for its energy systems, and that has to be reversed very quickly. But we have the opportunities. We know we have a richness of renewable energies out there, and we need to use those. Specifically on your question, I suppose the what happens if we don't comply, if we don't meet? I suppose the UN is like any UN bodies. There's no real sanction out there. There is obviously the moral imperative to do the right thing. And once you sign up to an agreement, you certainly are expected to achieve what you said you would do. So that's where it is. There's no big global army going to come in and sort of take you to task and bring you up in front of a court and say, you have to do this. Now, at an EU level, it's different. There are certainly at an EU level, if you don't achieve your targets, then there are significant implications within the EU bubble and or within the EU family, I suppose I'll put it like that rather than bubble. So there are targets and costs, especially if you don't meet, not just on emissions, also if you don't meet the energy targets, etc., etc. So yes. Within that regime there are, but globally it's a matter of, it's our collective interest to do this. And the what John referred to as the national determined contributions, the NDCs really say to countries, this is your nationally determined contribution and it's up to you to live up to it. And that's what countries will need to do, and we need to take stock of, are those contributions enough? When we add them up, is that enough? And if they're not, how do those countries respond? And that's what the Paris Agreement, the ratchet mechanism in the Paris Agreement, the global stocktake, will enable us to do.
Yeah, and as you say, Frank, there are those processes within the Framework Convention and within the Paris Agreement to go back and review progress. And one of those is this structured expert dialogue that I'm co-facilitating, that Frank is also playing a part in, which is all part of the second periodic review of the convention to see, is it achieving its goals? So there are those mechanisms, but yes, there aren't penalties. There's no criminality that can that countries can be accused of. It is this collective sense of peer pressure and the need to look after each of us. Question for you, John Finnegan, from Thomas Serkovich, on a business perspective. Because I know that you're looking at this, how Ireland Inc. is represented at COP. So how is the Irish government going to present the perspective of Irish businesses at COP, or how can Irish business engage at COP?
Through government, obviously, we we consult as widely as possible, like in our own climate action planning and so on. We've done an enormous consultation exercise with the public. We've engaged in structured dialogues. We've also asked for experts, people who specialize in certain areas to contribute. So we've formally gathered a huge amount. We also bring in stakeholders and expert people at that as much as possible, insofar as we're aware of them, into our decision making to try and gather. But it's the whole, every department is engaged in this. The delegation brings in every department. So whoever your contacts are in policy making government, be it IDA or your local enterprise office or Department of Enterprise, they are engaged in this, and you can feed in through those, and that's feeding into the suited government track of it. There is also the whole civil society aspect of it as well, which I presume is done by industry and done by industry bodies.
Yeah, there should be lots of different business coalitions that will be taking part at COP that you can be part of. Certainly there's going to be many also hybrid and online events in the context of COP26, which should even give greater opportunity for businesses in Ireland to be part of COP. Yeah, John.
I was going to say that Thomas will be well aware, of course, that businesses can themselves make their own pledges. They can make their own contribution, and they can look at their own emissions and make their own contribution in terms of scope 1 to scope 3 contributions. And of course, business in the community, which Thomas is involved in, is actively doing that. I think the general public will also be judging business as to what they're doing and whether or not those commitments are genuine, or whether they're very acute now, very acutely sensitive, the general public, about greenwashing, for example. And if businesses show a real strong willingness to make their contribution, I think the consumer will reward them, and there are signs of that happening already. And that will be quite a useful contribution to the national effort within Ireland, but also in terms of ensuring commercial viability for those businesses in the future.
Yeah, and just I think to say as well that if other people are looking for ways to get involved, you look at the COP26 website. There's lots of information there. I'm an ambassador for the EU Climate Pact, which is all around engaging people with climate action. And you can go onto the EU Climate Pact website, or even onto the Count Us In website, and you can get involved and say what your pledge is, or what your company or your community can do. And that's all registered and overseen, and informs the climate action that is delivered on the ground here in Europe. So there's many ways to get involved. There are questions here that I'll just bunch some together. They're related to kind of vested interests, and those vested interests also include, for example, some countries deciding not to increase taxes, I guess some corporations dodging taxes. Perhaps it's also linked to the way that the world has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're not being very equitable in how we share the vaccines around the world. John Finnegan, do you have any reflections on how that reflects on what we can expect of COP? Does that reluctance to act in the greater good in other political issues, I guess, affect also how countries might come together on climate?
I mean, one would hope, there are reasons for hope in international action on vaccination and on health. Obviously more could be done, but even in that, there is a recognition that this is a common problem, COVID, and there's a need to share vaccines and make sure that everybody is safe, because it's a pandemic and nobody is safe until everybody is safe. So you would hope that that thinking should apply even more strongly in climate, because this is one area where we're all in this together, and financing financing an action somewhere that allows a less developed country to reduce its emissions of carbon really directly benefits everybody. So I'm trying to be optimistic. The good stuff we've seen in response to COVID has been exactly that sort of solidarity and that recognition that we are in this together and nobody is safe until everybody is safe. And if we can build on that and that type of thinking, that's what we need to bring to climate, because that link is even clearer. That This is everybody's problem, and we can't deal with it until everybody is doing the right thing, and can do the right thing. I think they have the resources to do it.
Yeah, I think what's important as well there, John is alluding to, is the importance of transparency. The civil society would love to know what is the negotiating position that our negotiators are adopting on various issues What brief are they being given? Because not referring to Ireland, but one suspects that there are other countries where their negotiators are told, don't give anything away. Don't come back with a no-scoring draw if you can, but don't come back with anything that you've conceded. And that's bedeviled the whole process for 26 years now. And I think it's that transparency that we need to open up the window into what are our negotiators saying, what brief have they been given, and how can we influence them if we feel they're going the wrong way.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, John, there's a need also for transparency around what is being done. So we have a big focus in the COP as well on transparency around how are countries reducing their emissions, how are they showing that, what access do we have to each other's data, because that helps us all to have faith in each other. I see that my neighbour is acting, so I will act. Frank, I'm going to let you come in and add on to this, but I'd also like you to ask, see what you think about this very hard question at the end. So this is one I struggle with too. So you and I have been to many, many COPs, and every COP we go to, the problem gets worse. What are we doing wrong, and why should we have hope? I'm paraphrasing someone else's question, sorry, there in the chat.
What are we doing wrong, and why should we?
Like why after years and years of COPs, we're on COP26, as John said, why are emissions still growing? Why are we not getting the message across?
Well, I think yeah, it's easy to look at the various reasons why things have not moved on more rapidly, and John has actually alluded to them, that a lot of players are out there going for the nil-nil draw rather than the positive outcome. But I think John Finnegan has actually articulated in terms of the Paris Agreement is actually a wonderful document. And there's three elements to the three goals there. One on the temperature goal, the well below 2 degrees, efforts to 1.5. Then there's the solidarity, this adaptation goal. And then there's the financial flows. And obviously we spoke about the 100 billion that we're delivering annually or aiming to. But the big money is actually on the private sector, the markets. And I think now more than ever, we've seen engagement by those actors. And the fact that even at an EU level, there's a whole new taxonomy of how we do things, how we move those markets and ensure it's not greenwash, it is actually robust finance in the solutions. Certainly, we're way beyond where we should be in terms of the atmospheric concentrations. You've seen in Europe, though, major reductions in emissions. We have delivered on our aims, and we have articulated in the new Fit for 55 a really ambitious target. We've seen around the world other countries saying we're going to be neutral, net zero, etc. And we'll see more of that. And I think, Tara, it's very, as you know, it's very difficult to get that across the line in the negotiations. But around the negotiations, many countries are coming together in these collectives to say, yeah, we're going to work together to do that. And that creates pressure on the internal structures. So I'm actually more optimistic than I have been for quite a while, because I think the science has articulated how we do this. And I think there's enough, I suppose, common sense out there among everybody that, you know, we do it now, or we live with the consequences of not doing it, which are quite unimaginable for any rational group or person.
Yeah, no, Frank, I think that's a good hopeful note for us to start to draw to a close on. I certainly think that, you know, 15, 20 years ago or so when I started this work, and with the COPs, it was very much like we were just talking to ourselves. And nobody else heard us nor cared what we did really, or it wasn't important. Whereas now I see that right across society, from big corporates to our government, to civil society, to our children in school, climate change is very much front and center and top of what people on top of mind. But we're also doing more than just talking about it, which is the critical difference. The Paris Agreement set the direction of travel and told us all what we needed to do. And I think now, if this can be a real focused on implementation, on getting things done, on action on the ground in all of the countries that take part, then that will be a really positive thing. And each of us as a citizen of the global community has a role to play in holding our leaders to account, asking questions, looking to see what countries are doing, how we're spending our money, what policies we're making, and using our voice along in any way we can in that trajectory. But I want to thank our amazing panelists. Thank you to John Sweeney, John Finnegan, and Frank McGovern for explaining to us all and giving us insights into COP and what we should expect. Thank you to the audience for all the questions. They were really great. I didn't get to all of them. I got it to as many as I could, and sorry, I grouped some, so I hope nobody is upset with me for that. A recording of this panel discussion will be made available on the Dublin Climate Action website in due course. But I think what we saw here today was a real insight into, all these issues, from the need for consensus and solidarity to the political difficulties of getting countries to make agreements. We had an insight into what it is to be perhaps on the suit-wearing, more formal, less exciting part of the negotiations versus what it can be to be part of the expo that is a COP. I really want to thank the Dublin Climate Action Regional Office for organising this event this afternoon as part of Dublin Climate Action Week. In my past, I used to spend this week every year in New York at New York Climate Action Week, and I am much happier being here as part of Dublin Climate Action Week. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity to have those kind of conversations we used to have to travel far for right here on our doorstep. You can check out other events that are going on during the week at www.dublinclimateactionweek.ie. I'll say that again, www.dublinclimateactionweek.ie. And Gaurav Mahagat to you all for being part of this session. Please do take part in further sessions, including one I'm doing this evening on how to save your planet one object at a time. You're welcome along to that if you want to make some changes in your own household. And thank you. Have a wonderful afternoon.